Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on your time zones. And welcome to this very interesting guest lecture from an old friend and colleague of ours, Mozaharul, better known by all of us as Babu, who is based at UNEP in Bangkok, but who has been working on this issue of adaptation for many years. And he has come up with a very interesting paper. It's on aggregation of adaptation goals at different levels and scales, a conceptual framework which tries to bridge the big gap between local level adaptation and global adaptation goals, which is an ongoing discussion at the moment. So this is very, very timely. In a moment, I will invite him to give his presentation. We will then have two designated discussants. Firstly, Professor Mizan Khan, Deputy Director of ICAD, my colleague, and secondly, Danielle Falzon, who is a PhD candidate at Brown University in the United States, and also a ICAD alumnus who has been working on adaptation as well. So after the two designated discussants have given their views, we will then open the floor for discussion. But in the meantime, if anybody has comments or questions, feel free to put them into the chat and we can deal with them, respond to them after the presentations are over. So let me introduce Mozaharul, who should not need much introduction to our audience. He joined the United Nations Environment Program in 2009 and is still serving there as the Regional Coordinator, Climate Change for Asia and Pacific Office. He provides strategic and technical guidance to design and implementation of climate change actions. Before joining UNEP, he worked for Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies and led the Climate Change Program. He has also served the Ministry of Environment and Forest, Government of Bangladesh as the National Project Coordinator and successfully formulated the National Adaptation Program of Action, or NAPA, following a very inclusive nationwide consultative process. And then he also participated in climate change negotiations for more than 2 decades and coordinated adaptation group of G77 and China during 2007 to 2009. He also worked as a lead author for Working Group 2 for the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, and he received an International Fellowship Award in 2006 for 3 years by the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED in London, under the Climate Change Program. So I'm very proud to be a long-term associate of Babu. We have, in different capacities, we have collaborated and worked together for many, many years. So it's a privilege and a pleasure to invite him to share his talk with us. And then hopefully we will have some very useful and constructive discussions after that. Babu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Hawk, for introducing me with the audience. And as you mentioned that we have long working relationship. I think it is more than the 2 decades, or close to 3 decades that we are working together. And it's my pleasure to also talk to the audience today about this important topic on aggregating the climate change adaptation when the global process has agreed and come up with a global goal on adaptation without defining much of it. So it is my pleasure, the small team that that we work together to come up with this framework paper, which I will present it through a PowerPoint presentation, but I'd like to mention that IDRC actually put a small team, which I am leading, to come up with the framework paper. So let me start showing my slide. Is it visible? Thank you. So this is the conceptual framework paper, as I just mentioned. So are you take you through the paper that we have developed. And then let me just outline what this framework paper consists of. So it has a background section. Then we also presented the global goal on adaptation, and then we tried to unpack based on the literature available. Then we also presented in the framework paper the aggregation of adaptation goals and objectives, and the aggregation, the approaches. And then we also suggested some steps to collect the data and information for the aggregation. Then we also presented a very brief section on the conclusion. So let me begin with the background, why we decided that it may an important area of the work to come up with this, the aggregation, the framework paper. As most of us know, that the 2015 was a milestone of the multilateralism. We have the three main agreements that the global the community has come up with and agreed. One is the Sendai framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Paris Agreement. And if we look into all those three, the multilateralism, the framework, we have the commonalities and we have also the complementarities among these three, the global the agreements. And then those commonalities, if we just briefly touched upon those commonalities, one is the time frame. Is the 2030 is one of the common the time frame. But if we look into the adaptation and the global goal, that goal doesn't have the time frame. So I will come and explain that a bit more. If we look into the beneficiaries, or who are actually the target audience in terms of getting the benefit, both under the SDGs, Sendai framework, or the climate change, is the people-centric. So that is another the common area that the benefit should reach to the people. If we look into the Paris Agreement as a whole, and in terms of the process that it has adopted, isn't a bottom-up approach it has adopted. For example, the nationally determined contribution is in a bottom-up approach. If we look into the national adaptation, the planning and the processes that they have agreed is also the bottom-up approach. And this is one of the fundamental difference, particularly in the context of the mitigation, if we compare it with the Kyoto Protocol, which was very, very top-down, the process where the NDC is the bottom-up approaches. Both approaches has its own pros and cons, but this is how the Paris Agreement adopted the bottom-up approach. If we look into specific to the global goal on adaptation, and it has the three main objectives, and those are enhancing the adaptive capacity. If we look into the Article 7.1, and strengthening the resilience, as well as the reducing the vulnerability to climate change. Now, as I mentioned, that we don't have any agreed or the common indicators and the time frame for delivering those objectives, as well as measuring or tracking the global goal on adaptation. So we have the shortcomings in the global goal on adaptation. So within that broader context, what we thought that maybe it would be good to come up with a framework paper and presenting a logical structure and the methodology for aggregation of the adaptation goal and the objectives, as well as how to define the target at the different levels. And then when we are talking about the different levels, we thought we considered the different system and the subsystem as a level, which I will explain later on slightly, as well as the different levels, and it can be the geospatial level, it can be the regional level scale, or it can be the global scale. So that's the overall background behind developing the framework paper. Now, as I just mentioned about the three main objectives of the global goal on adaptation, so we thought that it would be also good to bring some of the discussion around the main objectives, the vulnerability reduction. So it is basically capturing the existing literature. It has nothing new in terms of the information, but presenting it in a way to show that these three objectives are also very much interlinked. They are not very much isolated in terms of, if we look into the way of the vulnerability is coming for the people of the system, or the way we are developing the adaptive capacity, or the way we are delivering the resilience support. So that is the reason we thought to present in this framework paper these three objectives and showing their interconnectedness and the complexities as well. Now, if we look into the reducing the vulnerability to climate change, the definition of the vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with the adverse effect of climate change, including the variability and extreme. This is a very standard, the IPCC, the definition. So we have presented that. And also we presented that if we look into these whole interlinkages, then it is basically the function of the character, the magnitude, and the rate of the climate variation to which a system is exposed to, and its sensitivity and its adaptive capacity. So these are the three main elements when we talk about the vulnerability. It's an exposure, it's a sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And if we also look into the fifth assessment report of the IPCC Working Group 2, which has further elaborated it and defined it as a propensity or the predisposition to be adversely affected. And many chapters of the IPCC report identified as the vulnerabilities through the social risk, particularly in the low-income economies. So if we look into this, the vulnerability and the reduction of the vulnerability, then it's basically what we are aiming under this particular objective is to see the changes of the vulnerability in terms of its status. Now, we tried to present it kind of in a function. Is the vulnerability, if we look into the system, this is one of the things that I'd like to also mention, that when we prepared this framework paper for the aggregation, we thought that the system approach is going to be probably one of the key way of organizing the data and information, and that will allow the aggregation. So we are talking about and taking the system approach in terms of the whole the aggregation exercise. So if we look into this, the reducing the vulnerability, which is basically the changing the state of vulnerability. So the vulnerability of a system, and if we look into the function of the three things, which is the exposure of that system, the sensitivity of that system, and the adaptive capacity of that system. So these three things is combinedly presenting the status of the vulnerability. Now, if we want to reduce that vulnerability, then obviously the status of the exposure, the status of the sensitivity, and the state of the adaptive capacity, changes of any one of these three will bring the changes of the vulnerability in terms of the reduction. So what we are also presenting here, that in terms of reducing the vulnerability, either we need to reduce the exposure, we need to reduce the sensitivity, or increasing the adaptive capacity. If we are able to do all three, the reduction of the vulnerability will be higher. If we are able to do one, maybe the reduction of vulnerability is going to be lower. So that is the way we also presented and to show how they are interconnected. For example, the second objectives of the global goal and adaptation is increasing the adaptive capacity. Now, increasing the adaptive capacity can also reduce the vulnerability reduction. So they are closely interlinked. So we cannot separate all the three objectives. That is also one of the big challenges in terms of aggregation. If we look into just the definition of adaptive capacity to climate change, is the ability of a system and institutions, the humans and other organizations to adjust to the potential damage, or to take advantage of the opportunities, or to respond to the consequences. because the climate change is going to bring the changes of the environment, and that might also create some advantages in some places. It is not the issue of whether the advantages is going to be higher than the potential damage. That is in a different discussion all over in the IPCC, but in general is basically the potential damage is higher than the overall the advantages of the opportunities. Now, if we look into further that enhancing the adaptive capacity, which will obviously entail the increasing the capacity of that system over time to adjust the potential damage and arising from the climate change impact. So this is again the issue of the capacity to deal with the problem or with the changes happening. Now, then if we look into the third area of the objective, which is generally defined as the ability of a system or a body to bounce back, and that is we call the resilience or recover, but the main essence of the resilience is to keep its shape, size of the condition from the stature of the stocks to a pre-stasis period. In some time we call about that what is the baseline of the system and what is the current state of that, and then the system will able to bounce back. So that is how the resilience is defined. Now, if we look into specific to the climate change context, then the resilience is defined as the capacity of the interconnected, the social, economic, and ecological system to cope with the hazardous event, trend, or the disturbance, and responding or reorganizing the way that maintain their essential functions, the identity, and the structure. So this is different from building the adaptive capacity and the reducing the vulnerability. But reducing the vulnerability, increasing the adaptive capacity, obviously will support building that resilience. So that's the interconnectedness of the three objectives under the global goal on adaptation. Now, we also tried to present it in the paper that if we look into the adaptation goals, the objectives and the target, they're not also completely isolated from the development goals and the targets. If we look into the reducing the vulnerability, there are the development efforts which is also contributing in terms of reducing the vulnerability, in terms of enhancing the adaptive capacity, also in terms of strengthening the resilience. So when we talk about the adaptation goal within the context of climate change, they're not also very much isolated from the development goal. So they are also the interlinked. The adaptation, the measures, if we look into enhancing the adaptive capacity, reducing the vulnerability on the resilience building, they are also connected the whole agenda of the integration into the development, concrete adaptation actions to implement on the ground, and also the adaptation plan that the countries are also preparing. And they have started, as Dr. Salim mentioned, introducing myself, the National Adaptation Program of Action, that the LDC. Currently, the countries are developing their national adaptation plans. Now, all those things contributing with the three areas, and they're also overlapping. So that is also another area that we also need to keep in mind when we're talking about the goal, setting the target, the time frame of this, the overlap and the interconnectedness. There is also another way of looking this interconnectedness of the global goal on adaptation in terms of the resilience, in terms of the vulnerability, and the adaptive capacity. So this is another way of presenting their interconnectedness and also showing the complexities of the adaptation. Now, let me move it to the main purpose of this paper, which is aggregation of adaptation goals and objectives. So what we presented in this paper is what are the fundamentals for aggregations? What are the key challenges of aggregation and the approaches? Now, let me just mention a couple of points in terms of the fundamentals of aggregation. The aggregation, the whole purpose of the aggregation is collecting data and information on homogeneous variables and presenting them in a summarized format for a particular purpose. So there's the homogeneity is an important element for aggregation. And if we look into the heterogeneity around this adaptation, which is basically one of the big challenge in terms of designing a system to come up with the aggregation. And in the context of the global goal on adaptation, this aggregation of the data of the three objectives in both the spatial and the temporal dimension of the climate change and the country-specific circumstances increases that challenges and the difficulties. For example, it is very common that we know that we cannot compare apple or oranges, and we cannot aggregate them too. But if we really want to aggregate the orange and apple test, then we need to actually convert the value of that in terms of either the nutritional value or the price. So, but we cannot compare or we cannot aggregate apple or oranges unless we convert them into their values. So that is the way that we need to overcome the heterogeneity of the adaptation and the objectives. Now, what are the key challenges of the aggregation? As I mentioned at the very beginning, that no universally acceptable target or no agreed common indicator for measuring the global goal on adaptation. So how to overcome that? Also, the lack of universally acceptable target or set of targets or agree about the time frame to achieve that. If we compare this global goal on adaptation against the sustainable development goals, it has a very specific target, the indicator, and how to measure. Also, if we look into the challenges, the second area challenge is the result. Can we actually aggregate the result? Can we compare the result? The answer is it's very difficult to aggregate the results and compare the results. So what we are also proposing in the framework paper is the aggregating the target, but not aggregating the result and compare them. It's not possible. Now, if we look into what the Adaptation Committee under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, what they have actually suggested an approach is starting with the bottom-up approach where they're identifying the adaptation needs through the NAP, which is an ongoing process, and communicate them at the different level via the adaptation communication, because this too, the mechanism is already established under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then they are saying that some of the needs via the NDCs and will be done by the adaptation committee. So it is basically the aggregation is primarily the adaptation needs. Which is one way of aggregating of the adaptation needs, but it is not giving the sense in terms of the target and the time frame, because this is going to be a rolling way that every country will be identifying their needs, and you can obviously sum of that. So this is one of the way the UNFCCC, the Adaptation Committee, they have proposed in one of the paper. Then the developing countries are to be supported both identifying the needs. So this is where the support is coming, and then the progress made in achieving the goal. So this is a very simple way of summarizing the need. And I do not know whether this is the right way of aggregating the goal and the targets. So we have also reviewed that. And this is where we come up with a proposed way of aggregation. As I mentioned, that is primarily focusing system as an approach and following a system approach. Now, let me just explain this briefly. If we look into the climate change, the variations and the variation in the context of the changes in temperature, changes in the precipitation, the sea level changes, and that will lead to the flood, the drought, cyclone, and maybe other the variation that will arise due to the climate change. Now, if we put the changes on the exposed system or a setting, it can be water, it can be agriculture, because those systems, irrespective of country, they have the commonalities. Within the system has its own dynamics, but if we put all the dynamics and if we use the system, we will able to see the vulnerability, but also the country will come up with their adaptation, the plan, and how to reduce the vulnerability of the system, or how to increase the adaptive capacity of the system, or how to build the resilience of the system against the climate variation. So this is where we are proposing is to focusing on the system. So we do the system analysis and against the climate variation. And then we see what are the impacts of the temperature, what's the impacts of the precipitation. So we do all the impacts analysis and the vulnerability analysis. And based on that, and this will come from the existing analysis, what we are suggesting here is not to carry out the new analysis, but using this framework to organize the data and information, but is in a more logical way. So once we know the vulnerability and the exposure, then we look into the three objectives in terms of reducing the vulnerability, enhancing adaptive capacity, and strengthening their resilience. And we see how the country is planning either avoiding the exposure percentage of the exposed land, or reducing the sensitivity of X percentage of current, for example, the agricultural crop, or enhancing the adaptive capacity. So this is where we are proposing organizing the data, following the climate variation, understanding the vulnerability, and then seeing how they are going to avoid the exposure of that exposed system, how they are going to enhance the adaptive capacity of that exposed system, and how they are strengthening. Now, once we are able to organize the data, as this is the system, for example, if we look into the agriculture system in Bangladesh, agriculture system in the neighboring countries, India and other countries, the system gives the primary entry point to aggregate those targets. So this is what we are proposing in the framework paper as a system level aggregation by target. And the common variables are the climate variation, the vulnerable system, and the adaptation objectives and the target. So this is what we thought is one way of developing the targets and the time frame, and then it allows the aggregation. Now we can also move upwards, like in terms of this, the targets, how that is actually connected or supporting the number of people, how that is supporting the economy and the environment. And then we can also do at a higher level aggregation in terms of the result, in terms of the people, economy, and environment. Now, we have also suggested that if we look into those plans, then maybe there are also the elements in terms of the adaptation, and it can be related to the climate governance, it can be the integration and the mainstreaming, it can be the technology related, it can be the finance related, and it can be the capacity development related. So this part is connected mostly with what the Adaptation Committee is talking about, the needs. So that needs can come from this way of organizing the data, and that can be another way of aggregating. So this framework paper gives the two main entry points. One is against the system and aggregating the target by each of the system or the result. Also looking into the needs, and we can do the aggregation by the needs under the 5 main areas. And then obviously connected those with the reducing vulnerability, enhanced capacity, and the build resilience. So this is the overall, the framework that we have developed and we have explained in the framework paper. Now we have also suggested in terms of organizing the data and information from existing sources. This is not what we are proposing that somebody needs to carry out the new assessment, but using the existing documents and organize the data. And by organizing those data and information, that will allow the aggregation, as I mentioned in the framework. So one is the climate change, the impact outlook, and then we have suggested the 2 steps there. And as I mentioned, the framework paper is taking the system approach and system as an entry point. And the systems that we have presented in the framework paper is basically all the systems that the IPCC, the fifth assessment report, actually done the assessment. Then the outlook of the climate change adaptation, and then we also talked about the capabilities to achieve the adaptation goals and objectives. And that is the different steps. I know that the time is short for me to explain all the steps, but the framework paper has elaborated on each of those steps. Now, let me end by reiterating that if we look into the adaptation goal, it not need to be a single goal in a country, or there is no need to be focused on a single level. So it can be, or not even in a system level or the scale. And also, if we look into the categorization of the goal, and the multiple goals should be undertaken at the various level, including the sector, the geographical, the national, or even the systemic. The adaptation goals needs to be defined and anchored in the National Adaptation Plan. The reason we are proposing, because this is going to be the process as the countries are already preparing their National Adaptation Plan, and they will be obviously revising and updating, because the countries are talking that this is going to be a living document like the National Adaptation, the nationally determined contribution, which the process has agreed that they will be submitting either the 5 years or the 10 years, which is still under the discussion. But they will be submitting the NDC on a regular basis, and also the sense the NAPS will is also going to be revisited. We do not know the frequency of it, but it is in a living document. And then what we are also reiterating, the aggregation at the global level based on the expo system of the country should not be used to compare the result of the global aggregation and the national aggregation, and also not to compare the result between or among the countries. So with that, let me thank you once again, Dr. Hawk and the ICAT, for giving me the opportunity to present the framework paper. Over to you, Dr. Hawk.
Thank you very much, Babu, for that excellent presentation. I found it very interesting. Well done. Very, very noble effort. I will invite our discussants, Professor Mizan Khan and Danielle, in a moment. But before I give them the floor, I can't resist adding a couple of comments from my side. And these are personal opinions. So firstly, in my view, it is just too difficult to aggregate all the different ways in which adaptation takes place. Bottom up, top down, different systems, different ecosystems, different geographies. So I am personally in favor of multiplicity of measurements. So you mentioned the analogy of apples and oranges. We can have apples. So apples, everybody has apples. We can compare one country's apples with another country's apples. We do apples, one system for all apples. All countries will do apples. And then another system for oranges. And oranges are different from apples. We don't have to add up orange and apple. So we can have, dryland ecosystem adaptations compared with dryland everywhere, deltas with deltas everywhere, mountains with mountains everywhere, something like that. In your systems approach, you have suggested something along those lines. The other way of disaggregating, in my view, which is what we do in ICAD, we belong to one camp on this, which is we believe in the the indicator that you used in your equation of adaptive capacity. And we just work on that, only adaptive capacity. And we see how we can enhance adaptive capacity. And the objective is not comparing between countries or even aggregating, but it is tracking over time. So the question is the adaptive capacity improving? Today it's at level 1, tomorrow has it gone to level 2, day after tomorrow has it gone to level 3? And it's an internal exercise. Whoever is doing it, they do it themselves. It's not evaluation from outside. It is internal assessment of my own adaptive capacity. I find a way to measure it and I will track it over time. The objective is not to have an aggregation. The objective is to improve over time, get better. And wherever you want to start with, we don't have to compare with others. So in my center, in ICAD, we want to work on building the adaptive capacity of people, not ecosystems, but people who live in the ecosystem. So people living in the ecosystems, vulnerable people particularly, and then how do we enhance capacity and measure capacity going forward. So yeah, I just leave these thoughts for you to react to later on when we have a discussion. But let me invite Professor Mizan Khan to come in, and then we will hear from Danielle. Mizan.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Salim. In fact, Babu and you already have conveyed my message in the sense that incommensurables cannot be compared, cannot be put to a common yardstick or a standard. That is the most difficult part of this issue, global goal on adaptation. But why it has got into the Paris Agreement, let me explain my perspective. I will draw an analogy here of this global goal on adaptation with the very vague concept of sustainable development. Because the biblical definition of sustainable development, you know, is a development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future. So the needs of the present generation and the needs of the future generation who are not in this world is very, very vague, because 7.5 billion population, each and everybody's needs differ. But that very vague concept of sustainable development had great strategic value in terms of inter and intra-generational equity, because there's that definition then qualified to look into the needs of the poor of the world and also of future generations. So that is the strategic value of the concept of sustainable development, but a personalization is being done since the last 30 years in terms of the 3 dimensions: economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and many different indicators globally comparable have been developed. So this global goal on adaptation, I think insertion of this goal in the Paris Agreement has got also a strategic value in terms of the fact that the physical vulnerability to our countries emanates from sources beyond our borders, because the climate change impacts we are forced to import. It's not our creation, particularly by the nano emitters, what I call countries like Bangladesh are nano emitters. That is the strategic value of the global goal on adaptation, because it always keeps harping on the international physical dimension of the atmospheric change of atmospheric chemistry. Now, how to aggregate? Aggregation is not possible globally, because vulnerability, you all know and will agree, that is a construct of physical aspect, location, as well as social and economic, which are also very much political, because adaptation is not just something technocratic as I look at, but very much a politically contested concept, because if we want to enhance our adaptive capacity, then we need to be looking into the underlying causes of vulnerability. which are structural inequalities in our societies. And with that impose these imported impacts. So these cannot, and aggregation globally is not possible. So what Babu you have suggesting is a right approach, I think. The systemic approach, system in the sense of specific natural resources or ecosystems, for example, mountain ecosystems or coastal ecosystems or natural resource-based activities like agriculture. There we can have some kind of common indicators, common denominators. That is where, because countries are differ greatly, economically, politically, socially. So we cannot compare country-based indicators because country or a sovereign state is something abstract. So I think that approach can be a good approach. And many multilateral regimes also have their own set of indicators, like Sendai framework for DRR. They have set of indicators. We have IC kind of 20 indicators. Then the UNCCD and all other regimes have got their own specific indicators. But what I think we can do is kind of not in terms of absolute number, but in terms of percentages. For example, if we look at through the percentage point, for example, enhancement of income level in a vulnerable area, percentage of income level, this percentage can be compared along the same ecosystems. So we need to look at through those prisms. So I'm not an expert in this area. Now, the complexity is compounded further by the fuzzy difference between adaptation and development. So I tend to like to use the word adaptive development, because adaptation is development in adverse climate. So virtually our whole, as Dr. Salim also argues, that our whole development process have to be adaptive. So we can call it an process of adaptive development, economic development as kind of an adaptive development. And there we need to develop this country level indicators. This is one thing. But again, this global or country level data don't speak the truth. They mask the reality on the ground. For example, GDP or the average kind of ecosystem health of an area, where people are at the center. And there are many different social economic groups out there. So we need, if we really want to do justice to implementation of this goal, even at country level, we need to go down to locally led adaptation, where data should be generated at the local level, which can really speak of the real looks or chehera, what we call, of each and every segment of the population. I think that way we can have progress, and then aggregation can be individual, local-led, region and country-based, then can be added as the sum to the sum total of the global goal on adaptation. I find only that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mizan. Some interesting thoughts on the problems and then how to overcome the problems.
Yes.
Danielle, now over to you.
Yes, so thank you so much, Babu, for that excellent presentation. I think this is a really interesting framework. I definitely agree with some of Dr. Hook and Dr. Khan's comments about making sure that there's sort of a self-determination to how we're measuring advancement in things like adaptive capacity, and making sure that addressing the roots of the problem is captured somehow in this systems approach. And I think there's absolutely room for that. I think it seems flexible to me. But yeah, so I think it's great. I think it's a much needed way to capture a lot of diverse and what's right now somewhat haphazard and piecemeal ways of approaches to adaptation going on in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. And there's not a good way to capture all of that right now. So I think that's it's an excellent way to start doing that. So I wanted to thank you also for going through a lot of the messy definitions that make up the term or like contribute to what we mean by adaptation between vulnerability and adaptive capacity, and how even in the global goal language, it says resilience, adaptive capacity, and reducing vulnerability. But then within vulnerability, we also have reducing sensitivity and increasing adaptive capacity. So the definitions are very messy. So I appreciated you laying that out like that. Sorry, I'm just gonna check my notes. Okay, one thing I did want to ask you, just as an IPCC AR5 author, something that I noticed when I was looking at the definitions of vulnerability was how in the AR5 definition, which you included, it's more inclusive, but it also sort of, the hazard has sort of disappeared from the definition. So it's mostly about sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So I'd love to hear from you also just how that definition was put together, just out of my own curiosity. But getting more to the bulk of the presentation. So like I said, I do find this really useful. So a lot of what I'm gonna say is mostly thoughts on complicating how we measure adaptation generally that I just want to throw out to also apply to this framework. So I'm wondering, I know you said that we're not necessarily comparing the aggregations, the ultimate aggregations, but I'm curious about the vision for measuring success or adaptation success in this systems approach, because ultimately there does need to be a determination of whether a goal is achieved, or whether the global goal on adaptation is achieved, and whether the objectives have been met. And I guess even in how I just said that, I sort of disagree with how I just said it, because I don't know if there should be a measurement like that where it's a particular objective or a particular indicator or something that's really concrete, because I think in a lot of ways, the way adaptation is currently being approached, that's somewhat limiting, because once the sort of check mark box has been completed, there's not as much, we don't delve into as much about what that looks like on the ground. And does that mean adaptation for people, or does that mean that the checkbox has been checked and we've reached the goal that was set in advance, when in fact, after doing the adaptation, we might realize that was an insufficient goal. So just it's some kind of, I'm curious more to hear more about what sort of success means, or what it means to actually aggregate towards adaptation. And that kind of brings me to my next comment is, I think maybe complementary to this framework is this idea of like what does it mean to be adapted? And that's something I'm curious about in general, just in terms of like a real life experience. Like, what does it mean for a coastal community in Jamnagar to be adapted to climate change? And because that should ultimately be the main goal, right? For people to be adapted. And of course that involves enhancing adaptive capacity for their own ability to adapt as things come. But what is the sort of qualitative main goal? Like, what does that actually mean in practice? So what is adapted, I guess, is something I want to just throw out there for us to think about in our conversation too. Next, I'm wondering, so this is probably, I know this is not necessarily how ECAD thinks about things, but I think I see conflicts a lot between adaptation and development goals, traditional development goals. And I know, of course, we're aiming for sustainable development, or even what Mizan was just talking about, adapted development. But even just thinking about like the COVID crisis, for example, a lot of the something I've been thinking about with a few people is that a lot of the alternative livelihoods, for example, that have been promoted as adaptation in Bangladesh were not sustainable in the face of that crisis. So even like think about crab farming, which has been, I mean, of course we know there's complexities to crab farming and shrimp farming, but I was talking to crab farmers in February before Bangladesh even shut down or had a COVID case, and they were saying that they weren't able to sell on the market because China had closed its borders. So just I'm curious about how traditional development has been imagined. Is that in conflict with, or does that need to be reimagined as well, as we're trying to promote adaptive futures for different people? So that is one challenge. Okay.
Thank you.
I have two quick final points. I promise I'm almost done, and then we can get to the conversation. I'll just go to my last one, actually. So the last thing I want to emphasize is centralizing this question of who decides in all of this. And I know, of course, Bobby, you were involved you were leading the NAPA process, which I know was deliberately inclusive. And I just, in all of this, thinking also of Dr. Huck's comments about comparing apples and oranges, and we should compare the apples with the apples and the oranges with the oranges. And I think there's like a certain level of self-determination that needs to come through every step of this, where it's not only who decides in terms of planning, but who decides whether we've, like Dr. was saying, whether they've moved up a step in adaptive capacity, what that actually means for their community or their family or their whatever level we're doing this at, multi-scalar. So just holding that, where does power and decision making come to play in this framework, and how do we make sure that things are being not only planned in a way that's locally led, but also that the goals and everything else, every way that we're measuring this is also being locally led and it's something that's locally appropriate. So I will leave it there, but thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Danielle. Some excellent comments and critical questions as well. I am afraid I'm going to have to leave at the hour because I have a hard stop. I have an important other meeting to attend. So Mizan, if you don't mind, if we continue beyond the hour, if I can hand over to you to take over and finish up. And before I give Babu the floor to respond to the comments, let me just give you my last intervention. I think we've started a very interesting conversation. Your aggregation framework has kicked it off, but let us examine, in my view, and I'm inviting you, Babu, with Danielle and Mizan and myself to think about this, writing something on what I will call the global goals with an S at the end of goal, not one goal, but global goals on adaptation. And let us think about this, the fruit analogy. You know, we'll have one set for apples, one set for oranges, another set for bananas. Can we disaggregate a number of goals which can be internally consistent? And the other question to me is, in terms of utility, I think the aggregation is a less useful function than comparison. Comparing across countries, systems, learning from each other, I think is a much more valuable, useful thing. You know, how is Bangladesh doing versus Nepal? Can we learn from Nepal? Can Nepal learn from us? So this comparability of who's doing how much and how well, and Mizan's point about having percentages as opposed to final figures. And again, finally, as I said, our biggest interest is in a bottom-up, locally led, self-determined direction of travel, not destination. We never know when we are fully adapted. There may not be something really fully adapted, but on the path to adaptation, being determined and setting our own goals and measuring our own goals, progress towards our own goals over time, to me, is a very important part of adaptive capacity building. When people are able to set their own goals, measure their own progress towards their own goals, that in and of itself is a very important part of building their adaptive capacity. They have some adaptive capacity to do that. So let me hand over to you, Babu, for some reflections, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'll have to leave exactly at the end of the hour. Babu, please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Salim, Mizan Bhai, and Daniel for sharing your thoughts as well as asking a couple of questions. So let me just reiterate a couple of points, and starting with the analogy that I have mentioned and Salim, you have elaborated, is apple and oranges. And that is exactly the reason in this framework paper, we are proposing the system as an entry point. And if we look into the system, for example, the agriculture or the ecosystem in the mountain or the coast, they have their own character and the commonalities. So ecosystem in Bangladesh, in the dryland or the floodplain or the coastal, has the commonalities with the ecosystem in India. So it's like similarly that we'll able to aggregate. Now, this is one of the things that I would like to also mention here. When in this framework paper, we are talking about the aggregation, it is not the aggregation of the adaptation actions and the results coming out from the adaptation actions. And let me mention and elaborate a bit on that. So this framework paper is basically proposing how we can identify and come up with the target based on the available information, and then see later on in terms of tracking whether those target has been achieved or not. It's like the SDG goals and the target. So they have come up with the target against the time frame, and now the tracking. So what we are trying to do here is not proposing how we are going to track the adaptation actions and outcome of that action. So before that is do we have the target, and can we aggregate those targets using the system approach? So this is one thing I would like to highlight. But obviously, the tracking the adaptation, the actions and outcome and their effectiveness is obviously the important issues. But what we are trying here, before tracking the adaptation actions and their effectiveness and whether meeting the target or not. So we are proposing between the vulnerability or the impacts and the adaptation actions, what is exactly the target that we are going to achieve through the different adaptation actions. So this is one thing that I'd like to just highlight, that this framework, we are not proposing tracking the adaptation actions and tracking the effectiveness of those actions, but isn't it before that, what are the targets and how we are going to achieve those. So this is one of the things that I would like to mention here. And through that system approach, yes, we are able to aggregate. We will also able to compare in terms of how the country is addressing the vulnerability or increasing the adaptive capacity in those particular systems. And that are absolutely going to be an important element in terms of learning from each other when they're implementing the actions and achieving those targets. The reason aggregation is important, not in the context of the country or the system, but for the framework convention on climate change, they need to report that where they are heading in terms of achieving their global goal on adaptation. So within that context, we're also thinking that this is going to be a contribution, and we know that many others are also contributing to that process. So we thought that it would be one of the contribution to the UNFCCC process, Adaptation Committee, and that system to consider that this could be another way of showing how the goal has been set and how it is progressing. But I'd like to just thank all of you. But in terms of the specific questions, Salim, I will start, but I will ask you to add how the hazards has been actually dropped from the IPCC definition in the 5th working group assessment. If I remember it correct, when we come up with the definition in the IPCC, the word hazard been dropped because it was actually incorporated in the Sendai, as well as the special report on ASREX on the extreme event. So. Okay. And if you look into the definition used in the ASREX and Sendai, you will see the hazard and the risk words are there. But when IPCC worked, they decided to drop it because they would like to make it more comprehensive than very specific to the hazard. That is what I remember, Salim.
That's right.
But maybe before you go and leave and hand over to Mijan Bhai, maybe you can add to that, but that is what I remember.
No, you're right, Babu. And thank you very much for your comments back in light of what you just got from our discussants and myself. You're quite right. In the IPCC, at the 5th assessment level, when we were doing the definitions, there was a group of people working on definitions, you may remember, who had a big debate on this. This was actually a lot of discussion around whether to use the word hazard, not use the word hazard. How do we define in the IPCC these different issues? And basically, from what I remember, the IPCC 5th assessment adopted the SREX definition that came out of the special report, or modified it slightly. I'm not quite sure exactly whether it was exactly the same or not. And then the IPCC fifth assessment is now what we in the IPCC regard. This has now become the accepted definition that we are using. And as far as I know, there's no attempt to modify or change it, as far as I know. But if there are no further questions, Babu, do you want to say anything?
Maybe just one more points, maybe as a part of reflection, which I mentioned that the purpose of this framework is not actually tracking the adaptation, but before tracking the adaptation, can we have the target against a time frame, but using the system approach, as you mentioned, and we can actually compare, and we can aggregate apple and apples. So that is the reason, if we compare that analogy, the system is the way, maybe a good way of doing that. So that is the one thing I'd like to just reiterate. And as you propose that maybe we can come up with some kind of a discussion paper, maybe 1-2 pager, is not one adaptation goal, but is in a goals. And that might also lead what I have started the discussion is in a system approach. And that system approach can lead to the multiple goals, like what we have in the SDGs. For energy, we have one type of the goals. For the urban ecosystem, the urban resilience, we have different type of goals. In terms of the poverty, we have different goals. In terms of the hunger, we have different goals. So if we look into the system, agriculture, water, urban, the 8 or the 9, the systems that the IPCC year 5 has actually laid down. And if we actually initiate that conversation, and we can then suggest that it's not one goal, but a set of goals, but focusing on those the systems. I'd like to just reiterate and add to what you have proposed at the very end. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So
thanks all of you for commenting on this framework paper. I really appreciate that.
Great. Thank you very much, Babu. Let me conclude our session, a very, very interesting session, by thanking you, thanking Mizan, thanking Danielle, and also the participants, some of whom have put comments in the chat box. We will share the PowerPoint presentation with everybody so you can have it. We will also share this recording so others can also follow it. And our takeaway task is I will follow up with each of you and let's see if we can write maybe a blog type paper, not a more elaborate scientific paper, but just putting out some ideas out there, maybe even a perspective paper. So I'm looking at Danielle to help us with some drafting, but I'll initiate the discussion by email. So thank you all very much. Let's call it today. Before we close, can I ask people to turn on their cameras for a quick screenshot of everybody? Please turn on your cameras if you don't mind, just for a second or two, so we can take a photograph, a screenshot of everybody who's here. And I'd like to thank everybody who is here.
Hi, Salim.
Hi, good to see you.
This is George from Nairobi.
Babu, very good. Excellent, excellent. Good to see you. Thank you very much. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Turn your cameras on and let's take the screenshot. I hope somebody in our team has taken the photograph. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. It's done. Thank you, everyone.
Done. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you all for joining from Nairobi.